many attendees here from both from the university as well as from outside the university. So thank you all for joining. So this webinar, as you know, has been organized in occasion of World Environment Day, which was actually yesterday, but there were a lot of events. We decided to do it today, and many of our speakers were involved in other events yesterday. So this webinar has been organized jointly by the Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities and the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. And it is primarily organized with the youth audience in mind, with college students, there even some high school students perhaps. And we had a similar webinar on June 3rd, where our Vice Chancellor was the moderator, which was also on the occasion of World Environment Day, and which had a similar theme, but it more widely on youth engagement. On this one, our theme is more targeted towards the energy transition. However, although it may seem like a specialized topic, we have organized the seminar to be targeted towards the youth audience. So all our guest speakers, even though they are technical experts, will all be talking in a more you could say a simpler way, which is understandable and relatable to a wider youth and student audience. In terms of introduction, the topic, is energy transition. Why is energy transition important? What is energy transition and why is it important? I think we're all familiar that most countries in the world, our economy depends on fossil fuels, which emit carbon dioxide, which is the main cause of climate change. As climate change becomes a more and more urgent problem, it is very important to switch from carbon-based fuels towards non-carbon-based fuels. Even though there are other sources of greenhouse gases which cause climate change, but the majority comes from our energy system, which is based on carbon-based fuels. So that is why we need to switch to carbon-free fuels, renewable energies, which you are familiar with, like solar and wind and so on. So that is the idea of the energy transition, and we have to do it relatively quickly. Because our entire economy depends on these. We have, for more than 100 years, our economy has grown dependent on fossil fuels, whether it is electricity, whether it is transport. Almost every aspect of our economy depends on fossil fuels. So that's why it's a wide and deep transition that is needed. How urgent is it? It's quite urgent. We are familiar with the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, where all countries in the world committed to trying to avoid catastrophic climate change. So scientists say that if we are able to hold the atmospheric warming within 2 degrees Celsius, then we can probably avoid catastrophic climate change. Climate change is already happening. A lot of disasters are already happening, but we have to avoid catastrophic climate change. In fact, latest studies are showing that even 2 degrees is quite risky. We should be trying to avoid increase of more than 1.5 degrees. So where are we now? We are already above 1 degrees. Compared to pre-industrial times, when we first started burning fossil fuels on a large scale, the average global temperature has already increased more than 1 degree Celsius. So we have only half a degree left if we want to avoid catastrophic climate change. So that makes the situation extremely urgent, which also means that there's only so much carbon dioxide extra we can emit before the atmosphere will be full, so to speak, and which would lock in 1.5 degrees climate change or more. So from that perspective, even though we sometimes tend to think of climate change as a long-term problem, it's very urgent. We have about a decade if we want to move our trajectory towards energy transition, carbon-free fuels. We have less than a decade to make that transition. So in that sense, it is very urgent. The commitments that the countries made under the Paris Climate Agreement are not enough. Scientists have noted that even if all countries meet their commitments that they made under the Paris Climate Agreement, we would still achieve almost 3 degrees rise in global temperature. So obviously, we need to increase our commitments. So that was the goal of this year's meeting. But however, because of the pandemic, this year's meeting was cancelled. So it has been moved to the next year. So hopefully we can take this time to increase our ambition. All countries need to increase their ambition if we want to meet this goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise. Some of you may be surprised to learn that India is the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. We tend to think of India as a developing country. That's true. India's per capita emissions are still quite low compared to world standards, world averages. But because India is big, it's a big economy with a big population, our total emissions are the third largest in the world after China and the US. So obviously that means unless India takes serious steps, we cannot hope to meet a global, we need global cooperation, and India is a major player. So India's energy transition is extremely important. So that is the theme of our seminar today. We have experts, from 3 different experts. So let me start by introducing all these experts to you. We have Mr. Chandrabhushan. He is the founding president of the International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology. It's a new research and advocacy organization based in New Delhi, which would aim to focus on energy, climate, sustainability, natural resource governance, with an emphasis on transformational change. So if Mr. Bhushan wants to add a few remarks to that during his introductory remarks, that would be fine. Mr. Bhushan is also well known for his more than 2 decades of leadership in as a leading environmentalist in India. He was the deputy director of the organization Center for Science and Environment, one of the oldest environmental organizations in India. He has shown leadership on a variety of issues: energy, climate change, energy access, industrial pollution, natural resource governance, environmental justice, equitable development, and so on. He has a wide range of policy influence. He has worked on many government committees, as well as internationally through South-South cooperation. Finally, he has won the United Nations Ozone Award for his contributions to protection of the ozone layer. His State of India's Renewable Energy Report into 2019 is a very acclaimed report. You can refer to it. It's very relevant to our discussion today. And finally, he is a noted columnist as well. So welcome, Mr. Chandrabhushan.
Thank you, Abhijit. Thanks for your kind introduction, and we will have our discussion.
Yes, thank you. Our next speaker is Professor Anika Bose-Dzynsky. She is Associate Professor at the School of Government and Public Policy, Jindal University, also the Associate Dean for Research and International Collaborations. She has a PhD in Environmental Policy from the Free University Berlin. She is actually joining us from Berlin today. Her main research emphasis is on market transformation for clean energy, and both in industrial as well as developing economies. She has many years of research experience in renewable energy, and particularly with an emphasis on electric vehicles. So we are using her expertise on the transport sector today. She has numerous research publications and as well as international conferences to her credit. I would just note quickly some of the prominent research grants she has received. The Erasmus Fellowship from the European Union, fellowships from the Norwegian Research Council, International Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies at Potsdam, as well as from Nagoya University in Japan. So welcome, Anika.
Thank you for having me. Hello.
Our final speaker is Dr. Ashok Kumar. He is the director of the Bureau of Energy Efficiency under the Government of India, a very important organization. In that role, he's heading the National Mission for Enhanced Energy Efficiency. Very important mission under our National Plan for Climate Change, National Action Plan for Climate Change. In his role, he leads the effort for enhanced efficiency in industry, for appliances, across the economy, including the transportation sector. He has also been part of the Indian delegation at the climate change COP meetings, at the annual COP meetings, the Government of India delegation. Which shows how important his role is in the Bureau of Energy Efficiency. Ashok has master's and bachelor's degrees in engineering from IIT Delhi and PhD in environmental and energy policy from the University of Delaware. Okay. So with that introduction to all our speakers, it's time to start our discussion today. We will turn to our first speaker, Mr. Chandrabhushan. We'll start off our discussion on renewable energy sector, particularly focusing on the electricity sector. Let me start with a brief introduction before I pose the first question to Mr. Bhushan. There has been an unprecedented boom in renewable energy all over the world, including in India. Even a few years back, maybe a decade or so back, even the most optimistic experts could not have predicted such a big boom. It's been a combination of technology improvements, fall in price, and so on. As a result, there have been rapid increases, particularly in solar and wind. So this gives us a big, it's a very optimistic, in that sense, it's a very optimistic time because of the urgency of climate change. If renewable energy, carbon-free renewable energy can grow so quickly, it seems like we do have a solution, potential solution. As the costs decline rapidly, we are close to what is known as grid parity. What does it mean? It means that the cost of these alternative energies are rapidly approaching competitiveness with our conventional sources of electricity in the grid, which is mainly dominated by coal, natural gas, and other fossil fuels. So, when we achieve grid parity, it would be a major breakthrough. In some countries, it has already been achieved. However, we still have to keep in mind that even if the price is competitive, renewable energy sources like solar and wind are intermittent. They are not generating all the time, which makes it a challenge to integrate it into the grid. Looking at India, just like other countries, India has also experienced a rapid boom in renewable energy in the last few years. In terms of installed capacity, non-hydro renewables are already 20% in India. However, we have to also note that in terms of actual generation, it is much less. It is only about 8%. Why? Because renewables are not generating all the time. Installed capacity 20%, but actual generation barely 8%, which also means that our mainstay of electricity, coal, we are heavily dependent on coal. For the electricity sector, coal is 50% of our installed capacity, but 75% of actual generation. So this is a very important point, that even with all the boom in renewable energy we have seen, we are still extremely dependent on coal. So that is the context I wanted to present. Now we can move to the first question to our first speaker. That what factors have led to the rapid boom in solar and wind in India over the last decade? CV.
Thank you, Abhijit. Let me, first of all, I want to give a little bit of historical context. And when I say historical, I'm talking about 10,000 years. Frankly speaking, human beings have not learned to produce energy other than by burning something. Think about it. The first source of energy was by burning wood. 10,000 years back, we learned to cook our food by burning wood. And even today, majority of world energy comes by burning something. So fundamentally, if you look at the technology transition, burning something, a biomass, a hydrocarbon-based source has remained the major source of energy for all of us. And if I were to say something, I'll call them as dinosaur technology. Practically speaking, these are not the technology fit for so-called 21st century world to provide energy to 8 billion people and going to about 9.5 billion people. This technology, as I said, is now absolutely not suitable environmentally, ecologically, from health perspective, and now also economically, because as Abhijit said, many of the renewable technologies are now reaching grid parity. And most of this has happened largely at the back of major innovation in renewable technology. First of all, these
Did we have a slight disruption?
these technologies are not finding grains as well as for transporting water from one place to another. And similarly, solar technology is not a new technology. Concentrated solar power has been used historically in wars. So both these technologies are not new technologies. These are old, and over the last 50 years, they have been refined to a scale where they can now, they are portable enough for us to use them. And now they are economically viable for us to use. One of the issues that Abhijit talked about was storage.
It seems we have a brief network problem at his end. While we wait for his link to be fixed, let me also add that to reinforce the point that Mr. Bhushan was making, that the technologies have advanced to the point that they can be deployed reliably. It's no longer a new technology. It's widely deployable and reliable. The second point is that, particularly for solar, large-scale manufacturing by China, when China entered the manufacturing market about the beginning of this century, that because of the huge economies of scale, they were able to have a transformative impact on the price. They were able to slash the price very, very rapidly. No other country could scale up production so quickly, so at such a large scale, and that has indirectly benefited everyone all over the world. Even developing countries now find solar at PV, the photovoltaic solar energy, relatively affordable. It's not yet as competitive everywhere, but because of the large-scale manufacturing of China, it has made a big difference in the last 10 years. There have been price declines of 60–70% over the last decade, which was, as I mentioned, which was unthinkable even 10–15 years ago. So that has proved to be transformative. So even developing countries like India or parts of Africa can now hope to invest in large-scale solar because of these price declines. As we wait for Mr. Bhushan to come back, perhaps we can move to our the third speaker, Ashok. Let me again introduce a little bit by his topic a little bit by saying that while we have started talking about renewable energy, we have to keep in mind what is known as the energy pyramid. I think most of us are familiar with the waste pyramid: reduce, reuse, and recycle, which means you have to reduce first and then consider recycling. Similarly, there is a similar concept, the energy pyramid, where we have to save energy first and then think of renewable clean energy. So unless you save energy first, then renewable energy should be a second priority. So in that sense, renewable energy is, energy savings is extremely important. And one of the most important ways in which energy can be saved is through energy efficiency measures. And that is where our guest speaker, Ashok Kumar, comes in. I'll start with a very interesting statistic before I hand it over to him, that according to a recent study by the International Energy Agency, IEA, which is one of the foremost think tanks in the world on energy, ever since the attention has been focused on energy efficiency in the 1970s, since that time, the top 10 economies of the world, these are the industrial high-income countries, they have saved 65% of their energy through energy efficiency measures. In other words, if energy efficiency measures have not been put in place in the 1970s and onwards, their cumulative consumption would have been 65% more than it is today. So it's impossible to overstate the importance of this statistics. We tend to downplay, we tend to ignore the importance of energy efficiency, energy savings. But this statistics just puts it in perspective. How much energy can we avoid through energy saving, energy efficiency measures? So if we can do that, then our need becomes much more manageable. If we can reduce our need for energy through energy savings, that makes our task much more manageable. So with that introduction, I would hand it over to Ashok with the first question, that India seems to be, or maybe is India a little bit late in the game in adopting energy efficiency? When was the Bureau of Energy Efficiency created? Why did we need a new agency? Were there other initiatives before? Or why was there a need to create a new dedicated agency for that?
Thank you, Abhijit, and distinguished panelists and viewer across the country, I guess, maybe some from abroad. So first of all, thank you for giving me this opportunity. And as I think I will take from what Abhijit and Mr. Bhushan has said from the context of historical perspective of technology, as well as the current developments, that how technologies are, in a sense, leapfrogging to the process where, efficiencies are improving, technology substitutions are appearing. So having said that, we also, as Abhijit again said, that we need to understand the importance of energy efficiency, the demand side part of it. There is a supply perspective where we see a rapid improvement, particularly in the renewable side. We have seen a huge capacities are being added across, not only in India, but across the world. But efficiency certainly plays a very important role, and particularly in a country like ours. Now, coming specifically to the question that Abhijit has asked, is that India has also responded to the oil shock of 70s, and there were departments called Department for Energy, if I'm not wrong. It was set up in late 70s and 80s, and then gradually this department has worked, it has expanded, and then finally that particular body really takes the shape of the Ministry of New and Renewable. So in that context, then the efficiency aspect comes after, say, around 2001, when the Act was brought out in the Parliament to establish this specific entity called Bureau of Energy Efficiency under the Act. So Bureau comes in life in 2002 after the passage of the Energy Conservation Act. So India, in a sense, is a very unique country, and we have responded well, and we have quite a good initiatives and infrastructure or the knowledge base for energy efficiency across the country. We have dedicated institutions. We have two ministries you should consider, Ministry of Power and Ministry of New and Renewable, in a sense, working together in the process of optimizing the usage. And particularly, I would emphasize that renewable has to keep in mind the efficiency aspect, because these two things has to go together. If you want to integrate a renewable, intermittent, a little lighter source of energy with an energy inefficient usage, then it doesn't make much of a sense. So we certainly need to see these two as a complementary to each other, and one has to go after the another. So that part of it, and since the foundation of Bureau has taken several actions, as I think you have mentioned in the introductory interventions, that India as a country has initiated several initiatives in various areas that we can conceive of in the industrial sector, in the appliances, in the buildings, in the transportation, and many other in the agriculture sector. So you name it, we have demand side interventions for energy efficiency improvement. And you would appreciate that India is one of the few countries, possibly one or two among the G20 countries, according to that climate change performance index or some report that shows that India is very few countries in line with the 1.5 degree trajectory of the climate addressing scenario. So India is certainly doing its bit in the global challenge. I would just to emphasize the historical and current position of our times is that India, for us, climate change is very important. You know, given that we, country as a nation, as a society, we have so intricately lives and livelihoods linked with the natural rhythms. We just cannot afford any change in the natural systems. We do not have any buffer to shield ourselves from 10 days or 15 days of monsoon. We just do not have any further possibility of cushioning the people by providing any sort of the calamities that can pose from the climate change. So for us, the climate change is very serious, and it is from the top of the government that energy efficiency and energy conservations are given due regard in this endeavor and country.
Yeah. Ashok, we have to learn about some of the specifics. Okay. So with that introduction, before my next question, let me ask all the viewers to, if you have any questions, we already have one question. So submit your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat box. The chat box is disabled. So if you have any questions, submit them in the Q&A box. So next quick question for Ashok, just, reply in 1 or 2 minutes. We have had a lighting revolution. How did India, again, within a span of 5 years or less, how did we end up having a lighting revolution?
The lighting revolution has been a history in itself. It started in 2015. If you see January 5, 2015, on the government calendar, you would see a item written Ujala. That particular scheme was launched in 2015, where the agency called Energy Efficiency Services Limited, an enterprise of the government of India, has brought out a very innovative business model where the entity has brought kind of aggregated the demand for LED bulbs across the country. And that aggregated demand, when it was put to the market for bidding, the sheer volumes, the scale of economy has brought the price of LED bulbs, which was available in 2015, around 300 to 350 rupees. In a span of 3-4 years, it has reached to around 50 rupees or 59, 56 rupees. So that is how this lighting revolution has happened, because of price coming down and people adopting, and also the realization of the efficiency of the LED bulbs. I think that short answer to that is how economy of scale can happen. The country like ours, how size matters, how the numbers matter.
Yes, so very good lesson here that economies of scale, just like we were talking about the solar panels, Indian Bureau of Energy Efficiency through the EESL, they achieved exactly something similar with the large scale demand aggregation for LED lights. So that's why prices came down so much, so we have widespread adoption. We have similar efforts going on in appliance sector. In the appliance sector, air conditioners, refrigerators, and so on. So the next question, Ashok, what is BEE doing for improving energy efficiency in the appliance sector, especially both in terms of standards as well as through the STAR labeling program?
Yeah, in the appliance sector, this Government of India or the Bureau of Energy Efficiency is taking several initiatives. If you see, we all know probably from the STAR rating that label is put on, particularly on the fridges, air conditioners, fluorescent tube lights, and geysers. We have, I think, 10 to 12 appliances which are mandatory. In a country like in our country, we cannot sell these air conditioner, refrigerator, tube light, distribution transformer, geyser, LED bulb. Even the LED bulbs cannot be sold in the market without the label. So the effort of this star rating program is to inform the consumers to make informed choices, because it gives an easy assessment of the performance of the appliances looking at the star. So more the stars, more the efficient, and if it is more efficient, it consumes less the power. So if it saves electricity. So that is a very simple program, and it is very well known, and I think the country recognizes those programs. And interesting part, just to add, that many manufacturers come to Bureau to get those labels on their own, because people ask for the label. So that is the level of outreach of this star rating program in the appliances sector.
Very good. So again, an important lesson that since we, at least in cities, we use appliances heavily, air conditioners, refrigerators, and so on. If there's a minimum standard, then that increases efficiency across the board. On top of that, we have these labeling programs where people can choose to buy a star-rated, more efficient appliance. However, Ashok, the question is, if the high-rated appliance, like a 5-star appliance, is more expensive, then a lot of people do hesitate in buying that. They would rather look for a cheaper appliance, even though we know that it's going to cost us more in the long term. So is there any way to address this challenge?
Yeah, this is a very good question, and a very, you can say, the real challenge, that how we'll persuade the people to, really understand and bring out what we call a life cycle costing of the appliances, so that they understand the whole return that they are going to get it. But of course, we understand that our people across the country, we are not that well informed of such costing analysis, and also the constraint of the resources that one has to pool at the upfront. So those are the challenges. How we kind of do is, it is public driven. We make awareness campaigns, we make advertisement and encouragements of certain information, and also we are in a process of improving the technology itself, upgrading the technology in a sense. The 3-star of yesteryears, or the 2 years back 3 stars becomes 1 star in after 2 years, or 5-star become 3 stars. So we keep upgrading the technology, and we keep informing the people of the benefits. And of course, as on date, with the government of India or the India as such do not see energy efficiency needs to be subsidized, in a sense that it is a business in itself. So people are taking on their own, they understand the economics of it, and they adopt it. And just to your information, if you see the air conditioner market, currently India's air conditioner market is over 56 or 57, around 60% is of the inverter type. So that itself shows that people are buying it. That is why the market is there.
Okay. So important challenge for energy efficiency. Moving to another challenge, we know that buildings, particularly heating and cooling of buildings, is a major consumption of energy. Although the Bureau of Energy has an energy efficient code, the implementation of that at the city level is sometimes a challenge. So Ashok, can you talk about why that is a challenge, and what can be done on that note?
Yes, you very well said that. First is that Bureau has, you have in the building sector, there is a national building code that BIS brings out. And then on top of it, Bureau brings out an energy conservation building code called ECBC for 2 categories of buildings. One is for the commercial building and another is for the residential building. It is also estimated that, the next new most energy consuming sector in the times to come is going to be the buildings, even surpassing the consumption from the industry. So that is the projection. So if that is so, then it is very important for us to have these measures in place for improving, making the buildings efficient. The buildings come under the state's list or the state's jurisdiction. So how it works is that the government of India at the central level brings out the note it is more like a guideline which notifies and had a statute, but it has to be notified again by the respective states. Once the states notify, then it also has to get into the municipal bylaws for really to be integrated into the process of the place where, you know, the building construction certification is linked to the codes. So we have progressed, quite a big progress in this aspect. Several states have, I think more than 10 states have already been notified those codes with the customization that is required for their conditions. Several states have also integrated into the municipal bylaws. So the progress is on, but however, we have certain it has to get into third layer of the government. So there is a challenge of, percolating down to that stage, but the process at the bureau level, currently we have what we call energy conservation ECBC cells across the states to help in this regard, so that their hand-holding is done to the states, municipal bylaw, brought into municipal bylaws, and so several activities are going on. So we are hopeful that, things will kind of speed up in the times to come.
Very good. So we learned how the importance of energy conservation in buildings, because India is in a rapid building boom. According to some studies, a majority of the buildings in urban areas that will be in India by 2050 are not even built yet. So imagine if we construct all of them poorly, then that locks in an enormous amount of wasteful energy consumption. So it's very important to make buildings efficient so that buildings have a long life, and over their lifespan, they can continue to save energy. Now, moving on to industry, we have been talking about buildings and appliances and lighting. What approaches have Bureau of Energy Efficiency taken to energy savings in industry?
Yeah, industry is a big chunk. Currently industry is the biggest energy consumer across the bigger sectors. So India has taken very innovative and progressive approach to improve the efficiency of the industrial sector. And currently a program is running, and which is very well recognized by not only in India but across the globe, called PAT, Perform, Achieve and Trade. This scheme has started in 2012 to be precise, but the initial works has started in 2010. However, it started its first cycle of 3 years in 2015. So that scheme has included, currently we have around 13 energy intensive sectors of the economy under that scheme. Be it power plants, cement, iron, steel, fertilizer, chlor-alkali, textile, paper, refinery, petrochemicals, the chunk of the energy consuming sectors are under this scheme. And to give you a short snap of this particular program's performance is that in the first cycle of this scheme, around 478 units from 8 sectors contributed to saving of 8.67 million ton. So this 8.67 million ton, if you don't give a context, doesn't make much of a sense what this number sounds. But this amount of energy saved is even more than the total energy consumption of a country like Costa Rica. Costa Rica is consuming around 7 to 8 million tons of oil equivalent. So such is the impact that this particular program has brought, and this is well recognized not only in India but globally, and many countries are in process of adapting to such a scheme in their own countries. So this is a story, and now we have into several cycles of PAT, and in the whole process of energy efficiency, including the industry, mostly coming from industrial sector, in the year 2018-19, we were able to save around 23 million tons of oil equivalent. So which is, I was looking at, which is even more than a country like, your total consumption of a country like Portugal. Portugal is consuming around 17 million tons of oil equivalent. And around 1/4 of a country like Pakistan. Pakistan is consuming 90 million ton of oil equivalent. So it's a huge contribution that this particular scheme is doing, and this scheme is well recognized by not only by the government in a sense, but the stakeholders, the industry also. So we have a very good response from the participants as well.
So we learned some fascinating statistics from Dr. Kumar, that through these energy efficiency initiatives, we have saved so much energy. When you say, X million MTOE you can't relate to it. Most people cannot relate to it. But he provided us a fascinating point of correlation, that more than the entire amount of consumption of a country like Costa Rica. So that shows what is the potential of energy efficiency, how much energy we can save, enormous amounts of energy we can save. But I would like to conclude with one point before moving on to our next speaker, that energy efficiency is great. We have a lot of potential, but solely relying on energy efficiency is not enough, because we also have to think of energy conservation. Energy conservation is a little different from energy efficiency. Energy conservation is about behavioral change. So if we rely solely on energy efficiency, if you save energy, you save money, and then you spend it on something, you have a great energy efficient car, then you save money, you drive more, or you buy an appliance, or you buy more stuff, which negates the gains that you made for that individual appliance or that individual car. So energy efficiency is great, should be our top priority, but we should also keep in mind the importance of conservation. So that we can now move on to our next speaker. Let me announce here, unfortunately, that Mr. Chandrabhushan has suffered a big power cut at his end. He has just messaged me. He's trying to get back. So we'll continue with our next speaker, and hopefully he can join us back in time for question and answers. Already we have a couple of important question answers for several speakers. I'm noting them down. We'll come back to them at the end. So now moving to the transportation sector, Professor Cieszynski is an expert on the transportation sector. India, as you know, is very dependent on oil-based transportation, road-based transportation. I was reading one statistic, 90% of our energy consumption in the transportation sector is from road-based transport. So we also know that road-based transport is not the most efficient. Rail is more efficient, water-based transport is more efficient, but unfortunately we are heavily dependent on road-based transport. That also means we have to rely heavily on oil, and India, we don't have much reserves of oil. We're heavily dependent on imports. Latest statistics show we are 90% of our oil comes from imports. So we see that we are spending a lot of foreign exchange for importing oil, and also transportation sector is a very important source of air pollution. I don't need to remind anyone of how bad air pollution is in India, in Indian cities, which are some of the most polluted in the world. So in this context, perhaps moving away from oil-based transport to electric vehicles can be beneficial at many ends. We can reduce our oil consumption, we can reduce our urban air pollution, but also to keep in mind that electric vehicles are extremely efficient. So even though our electricity coming from our grid is based on coal, because electric vehicles are efficient, so on a life cycle basis, even if you are drawing energy from coal, you are still contributing less pollution compared to petrol or diesel powered vehicles. Not only local air pollution, but also life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. So electric vehicles have multiple benefits. They're obviously not the ultimate solution, but they have multiple benefits. So in that sense, my first question to Dr. Cieszynski is that if electric vehicles have all these benefits, why is India just starting recently? Why have they started now? Why didn't they push for this transition several years or even decades back, like some other countries have done?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Let me start by saying that 80% of the oil imports go into the Indian transport sector. And with only 400,000 electric vehicles, you could reduce your import by 120 million barrels. You would reduce your carbon dioxide emissions by 4 million. Can you hear me well?
A little louder.
Okay. And not to mention air pollution that could be avoided. For example, in Delhi, we know that roughly 42% of the air pollution is due to the transport sector. So I would say that the first serious approaches to electric mobility started in the early 1990s, and that was the California Air Resources Board Zero Emission Vehicle Initiative. And you have actually a great visionary in your country who already in the early 1990s thought about the potential and the benefits of electric vehicles. I'm sure you've heard his name. In 1994, Chetan Maini founded the Reva Electric Car Company. So it's actually not that India is really late in that. There were some early visionaries. In 1995, the Delhi Metro Rail Corporation was established. And then in 1996, you have MC Mehta, who is fighting a PIL, calling for measures to improve air quality in Delhi. And I quote, "In view of the failure of the administration to do anything substantive in the matter." In the same year, we have also a publication by the Center for Science and Environment called Slow Murder, the Deadly Story of Vehicular Pollution in India. And, you know, this clean air leitmotif is kind of going through the years and decades of the discussion around vehicular pollution, at the end of which, it was in mid-1998 when the Supreme Court came out with a ruling on the basis of recommendations of the Burra-Lal Commission that instead of opting for some kind of clean power, they opted for a different kind of fossil fuel, and that was CNG, at least in the Delhi context. So three-wheelers and diesel buses had to be retrofitted. So there was a kind of, you know, digression, and that has to do in part with the fact that there were no electric vehicles at that point, and CNG is also considered less worrisome when it comes to diesel sulfur dioxide. So I would say that are the main reasons why we have not pushed for electric vehicles much earlier. But yeah, then end of 2002, you have the first line of the Delhi Metro Rail opened, and that is also considered a form of electric mobility. So, you know, things were happening.
Okay, very good introduction. Now, widespread adoption of electric vehicles are not easy, as India is struggling, other countries have struggled. So where do you think India is moving? What are the challenges it's facing? And these challenges have been faced by other countries in the world, and how have they overcome it?
Yeah, these comparisons are always difficult, but let me start with talking about India. You had the National Electric Mobility Mission Plan issued in 2013 with the first kind of numeric quantitative target of 6 to 7 million electric vehicles by 2020. We are not there. Germany also had a 1 million electric vehicle or electric car goal, and we are not there. The latest official figures I have for the last fiscal year are 156,000 vehicles, electric vehicles, battery electric vehicles registered. That's a 20% increase compared to the year before. And we also, you know, have, due to the fact that small electric two-wheelers and three-wheelers are not registered in the sense that they're exempt from the registration, we don't have actually the exact figures. However, in 2017, the government really came out with a big push. And Niti Aayog, in collaboration with the Rocky Mountains Institute, have developed some scenarios, pretty realistic, a business as usual scenario and a more transformative scenario where we want to see a 40% share of passenger vehicles in the share by 2030. Anyways, when it comes to the obstacles, I think one of the major obstacles is the fact that the auto industry prefers to have a more gradual shift. You know, there would be a lot of stranded assets. A lot of people would have to be retrained. a lot of investments have been made into the conventional technology. So it's very understandable that the auto industry is a little bit cautious about, the speed at which we change. So they have come out, the Society for Indian Auto Manufacturers has come out with a white paper kind of telling the ministers that, this introducing electric vehicles in a very big way until 2030 is maybe not very much in the interest of the auto industry. So maybe that can be pushed to doing over here.
Okay. Two quick questions, related questions to Chandrabhushan. Professor Rajneesh Wadera is a visiting faculty here at Jindal. He's asking, he already I think asked one question. His second question is that what is the rationale, or is it a good idea to include hydro under renewables, which is the recent government decision to make up for its target. India has a very ambitious target, 175 gigawatts, and for a while it seemed we are going to on the path to meet the targets, but now it seems more challenging. Whether adding hydro to that target is a good idea or not. And the second question is, due to the cash crunch because of the economic crisis, what are the prospects for a boom in financing for renewables going forward?
So globally, the definition of renewables does include hydropower. Okay, and in India we had opposed it, and because of ecological reason, even though if hydropower is renewable in terms of carbon emission, pollution, as well as source of energy, they have huge ecological implications, and we have seen that playing out across Himalayas in these countries. So, but globally, hydro is included as part of renewable. Now there is another definition that is coming, which is new renewables, which excludes hydro. So from definitional issue, it is fine. But as far as target is concerned, we are quite clear that India's target of 175 gigawatt does not include hydro. If you look at we have breakdown of target and how the target will be met, it doesn't include hydro. So if India, I don't think that is the intention of the government to include hydro to meet the target. But if they have that intention, then it is not correct. But the breakdown is very clear. We will have 100 of gigawatt of solar, 60 gigawatt of wind, and 15 gigawatt of biomass. That's the breakup for meeting 175 gigawatt. The second question was the cash crunch. I think that considering the risk that is there in fossil fuel industry right now, especially coal, investors will be looking at renewable energy. To put their money, not on the coal. So, though there is risk right now and everyone is sitting tight right now, but once the market opens up and investment starts, I think the private sector will put its money on renewable energy and not on coal. So, I think over the next 6 to 7 months, you will see investment going ahead in the renewable energy sector compared to coal. That happened in 2019 as well. In fact, 2/3 of all the capacity we installed in 2019 was renewable energy, not fossil fuel. I just want to, this is a point which is important. I always get into this discussion on coal phase out between developed and developing countries. UK has phased out coal because it has gas. It is very important to understand these nuances. Okay. Germany is phasing out. It is taking, think about it, it has only about 20 gigawatt or 24 gigawatt compared to India's, 200 plus gigawatt of coal, and still requires 18 years to phase out. And this has been the crux of problem in climate change debate. That if developed countries are going to take so much time to phase out coal or move from coal to gas, how do you expect developing countries to do it? So it also becomes an issue of climate justice and equity, which needs to play out. So while I completely agree that if coal will become uncompetitive going ahead, and if we add carbon and pollution tax, it will become even more unaffordable. The fact is, while these logics are not working out in developed countries, I have failed to understand. Okay, US is going to shale gas massively. And now if you look at the life cycle emission, even if there's a 3% leakage in natural, it is as bad as coal as far as climate change is concerned. Okay. So I have failed to understand why the logic of environment and climate is not getting developed countries out of gas. I don't think coal is bad and gas is good. That argument should work out. Okay. I think that's a very, very bad argument to make. Okay. And, because as I said, gas is as bad climatically as coal is. So I think globally, this discussion on coal phase out, that I will first phase out coal, then phase out gas, and then phase out oil, is an environmentally destructive argument. Okay, we have to phase out whoever can based on the sound logic of market and environment, and adding carbon tax and environmental tax. Think about phasing out all fossil fuels. Not think about that we will, because India doesn't have gas. India can argue back saying, listen, you have access to gas, I don't have. Okay, I don't have that second transition to make. And therefore, for me, it is important to move directly from coal to renewable. So it is a much more complicated discussion than simply adding carbon and environmental tax on coal for phasing out. My argument would be we need to put equal amount of these things on all fossil fuels and think about global phase out if we really want to solve the climate crisis.
Okay. Since you touched upon this problem, maybe I'll ask another question. We know that almost 200 million people in India don't have reliable access to electricity. So in terms of expansion of access to these remote and rural areas, do you think these should we expand the grid, which is heavily dependent on coal, or we rely on mini grids or micro grids powered mainly by solar? And what would be the challenges? It's currently, it's not really, business is not very viable. It's currently mostly working through philanthropic initiatives. How do we make this transition to self-sufficient and commercially viable microgrids in rural areas?
I think grid has reached 99+ places as far as reaching the grid is concerned. Even if electricity has not reached, grid has reached. That has happened in last 10 years. More or less everywhere you have that wire that has reached there. The issue is actually not wire. The issue is business model, which is going to be affordable for the poor. I think that is much more important. As I said, if you take distribution company put all distribution company in India together, then they all are bankrupt. Frankly, they have negative asset. Okay. They have 5 lakh crore rupees as overall liability, and every year, our T&D loss is more than 20%. They are losing, hundreds and thousands of crores of rupees every year as far as annual loss is concerned. As I said, they're negative asset, they're bankrupt companies. And we have gone through a series of reform policy to reform them, but the result is not coming out. So frankly, the business model of distribution company and the centralized grid is actually quite expensive for the poor. We have done that in the name of the poor, but frankly, it is quite expensive for the poor. So the new business model that will emerge, I don't have time to explain that. Maybe sometime we can discuss what the new business model is going to be. But the new business model is going to be very decentralized going ahead. It is going to be the Uber model. I always say it is going to be an Uber model. You will have a large number of companies who might not have asset, but they will be in the business of distribution. You will have virtual discoms. You will have prosumers going ahead. And we already have large number of producers and consumers of renewable energy, which exists. So the future of distribution of electricity is going to be very different than what we have, because what model we have is a 20th century model of early 20th century of centralized generation and centralized distribution. That will not work going ahead. So from that perspective, I think we have to start looking at a new business model.
So I think we have exhausted all the questions, which is quite unusual. In most cases, for seminars, we don't have time to answer everybody's questions. So I think we can congratulate ourselves on that. Before we end, should we ask any of the speakers to have any final comments, if you want 1-2 minutes comments? Ashok?
Thank you, Abhijit. I don't have much to comment, but I would also again remind myself that, you know, this, as there was some cartoon that was showing where, you know, the wave of COVID and wave of recession and the wave of climate change coming. So from the size of the wave, you know, one can realize how big the challenge is in the midst of the COVID challenge that we are going. So I think for us to be very mindful of where we are, and as an individual, wherever we are, we have, history has put us in a certain position where we really need to live up to the time to respond to whatever ways and means we can do. So that is, I think, you know, what it seems for us, you know, within our limited wisdom, whatever we can do. So that seems to be more important. But just to take this opportunity, I would congratulate Mr. Bhushan for the foundation of new organization, and I wish him luck and best wishes for the wonderful contribution that he would keep continuing. So with that, I stop. Thank you for, you know, the opportunity.
Thank you, Ashok. Anika, any last comments?
Yeah, well, when I saw your questions, you know, what can be learned from others? You know, I think there's always something that can be learned, whether it's from the successes or the failures of others. But in general, my understanding is that the local conditions are so different across the different cases that I have seen, whether it's political, socioeconomic, cultural, the urban patterns or climate, that I just don't believe in the one-fits-all solution anymore. So we really have to find solutions locally that, you know, are suitable, that create win-win situations, and yeah, and to collaborate as good as possible also internationally on finding these solutions. That's maybe how I want to end my contribution for today.
Thank you. Chandrabhushan, any last comments?
First of all, let me thank Ashok. We have not met for a long time. So thank you very much, Ashok, for your wishes. And let me end by saying that I think Churchill said that every crisis is an opportunity. And COVID crisis does tell us how precarious is our economic system, or our general, you know, the structure of our society. In India, it became quite clear to us that the migrant crisis shows the inequality in our society. And the COVID crisis shows the inadequacy of our health system. And, you know, we will have to start thinking afresh what kind of society, and this is not exactly about India, but across the world, what kind of world we want. I'm not sure that the leadership will think like that, but I do believe that civil society will have to start rethinking and, you know, envisioning a world which is very different than what we have today. One virus, think about it, frankly speaking. You know, I'm not downplaying the emergency issue, but one piddly little virus has frankly brought the world to its knees. One virus, okay? And we talk about artificial intelligence and biotechnology. That's what we keep talking about. And the way the projections are on climate change, this is almost like a trailer, you know, the trailer of a movie, frankly. So I believe that civil society will have to start rethinking itself, what kind of world we need, because things are not really good. And, you know, I want to end on this, that let's use COVID crisis to rethink a new world.
Thank you, CB. On that note, I would start my own concluding remarks on an exactly similar note. As I mentioned, this webinar is targeted towards the youth audience. So we have seen the youth uprisings all over the world in support for climate action, and in many countries, it's actually starting to have an impact. So let's hope that awareness initiatives like this one or the other events that we have organized would start having an impact. We'll start to see similar youth initiatives going forward in India, and perhaps that would lead to a democratic demand for change. You know, the reason we don't have clean air in Delhi or in India is that there's no democratic demand. And the environmentalists complain, but there's no widespread democratic demand. So similarly, we must see, as Chandrabhushan noted, we must see a democratic demand, a majority demand. Like I like to use the example of girls' education, for example. In most countries, it's universally accepted, and all political parties, in fact, political parties compete with each other to demonstrate who is better at girls' education. So perhaps we need to see a day when political parties are competing with each other to demonstrate who is best for the environment. So that won't happen unless there's a widespread democratic demand, and the momentum must come from youth going forward. So with that note, I would like to end our session here. But before ending, we must thank a lot of people who have been associated with it, starting with the deans of School of Liberal Arts and Humanities and School for Government and Public Policy. We also must thank the IT team. Vidyut is here, who has been with us not only through organization, but throughout the session today. Also the design team who created the posters. Admissions and outreach who helped in the publicity, several JGU faculty who has either participated directly or have helped to publicize it to other students, with Dr. Armin Rosenkrantz, Dean of School of Sustainability, Professor Sirup, Professor Mimi, Professor Atre, Professor Swati, Professor Siddhi, Professor Aditya Ghosh, Professor Amlan is here joining us, Professor Hebatullah, and finally Professor Rajneesh, who participated and asked a lot of pertinent questions. In addition, we also like to thank finally some other organizations who have also participated or promoted the event. These include Professor Manu Athai from Azim Premji University. We had participation from IIT Madras, IISER Pune, BITS Pilani, TIS Mumbai, Jadavpur University, Administrative Training Institute Calcutta, and also non-academic institutions like Auroville in Tamil Nadu, as well as GIZ India and TERI. So all these partners deserve thanks for either participating or helping to promote the event. So I think we have done well on time, a few minutes extra with all the question and answers, final comments and vote of thanks. So we can end here, and I would like to thank all the audience once again for joining us.